Welcome to another episode of Yu-Gi-Oh! Player Ranks. In this series, we rank various Yu-Gi-Oh! Themes based on your comments and suggestions. Come back every tier list Tuesday to see an all-new installment of this series. Alright, what's up guys? We are back. Today we are doing Predaplants. Predaplants is an extremely important archetype. It's had so much meta impact over the years that it's been released. It's kind of insane. Super Poly targets, Verde Anaconda, a fusion engine in branded, the pure deck itself. Like, this deck has been meta relevant so many different ways. It's almost kind of incredible. So we're doing this. This is by viewer request, of course. And if you want any specific archetypes, please let me know in the comments. And there's also a playlist available for this. So if you want to watch a bunch of these instead of whatever you're doing in your normal life, if you're listening, play this in the background, you can click the playlist and we have a bunch of these videos available. But yeah, let's get started. First of all, we got Predaplant Trilantis. I think this is a B tier card. This card is actually quite good. Basically, when it leaves the field for like fusion summon, it goes to the top of the extra deck or goes to the graveyard. So you can send it off of like a fusion that's sends to the graveyard, like branded fusion. But basically, when it leaves when it goes to the graveyard or the top of the pendulum zone, you can place counters, Predaplant counters onto monsters equal to the amount of monsters that you control. This does not target, so it can help you out some really important stuff later on. It's actually the best way to place Predaplant counters on things. You can make an argument Predaplanting is better, but this is a pretty good way, even going second, to place counters on things without having to wait a turn. Also, it has its monster effect. That was its monster effect. Its pendulum effect is that it allows you to fuse using pendulum scales. So you can use itself out of the pendulum scale, and that effect is actually quite good because, yeah, it's just another fusion material available to you. All right, next up is Predaplant Moray Nepenthes. This one's a little tough to grade. I'd probably say it's somewhere around D tier. I don't see myself playing this in any way, not even as a tech choice. Basically, what this card does is it gains 200 for every Predaplant counter on the field, which actually we didn't even speak about Predaplant counters. Predaplant counters are basically counters that go on monsters, and they turn those monsters into level 1 monsters. That can be useful against sprites and other decks that rely on certain levels. It could be good against like Sword Soul. It could be good against basically any deck that relies on your monsters being a certain level. It can be very relevant because it turns them into level 1, and that can be very important. So that's what a Predaplant counter does. And then based on having Predaplant counters, all of the Predaplants actually gain additional effects in some way, and some are better than others, but this is one of them. It gains 200 attack for every one. This is only this is only a 1600 attack monster, so it gains 200 attack per. I mean, again, putting Predaplant counter is probably the hardest thing to do in the deck. So it's just not really worth it. On top of that, it has an effect where if it destroys an opponent's monster by battle, you can attach it kind of like a Relinquished or a Thousand Eyes Restrict to this monster. And then you can, if you want to, destroy that monster and then gain life points equal to that. It's not even really all that great in time because, like, yeah, even in time, you have to enter the battle phase, do damage, take the monster, then gain life points. So it's not even good to like cheese out a win. The card overall, I just wouldn't recommend playing this card. Next is Predaplant Yugioh. I think this card is like a C tier card. I probably would never play it, maybe as a one of, but that's about it. Basically what this card does is you contribute your opponent's monster and summon this card as long as it has a Predaplant counter on it. Now the problem with this is this card is a level 6 and it's almost like a kaiju, right? Because it basically allows you to tribute your opponent's monster, but the problem is they already have to have a Predaplant counter on it. And if a monster is unaffected by things, it's tough to get Predaplant counters on it in the first place, and that can be a little bit of an issue. Has another effect that is actually quite good too, which is if this card leaves the field, you can place Predaplant counters on all of your opponent's monsters. And again, that effect is actually quite good because you place all of these Predaplant counters on them, and it's an easy way to do it. But that effect only works if this card is sent from the field to the graveyard. So again, you can summon it off of like you can summon this card off of like the fusion monster, the new one, the level 5, you can summon it off of him by attributing another monster. Like, there's ways to get this onto the field, but it's a little inconsistent. The kaiju effect is kind of cool, but again, it would be nicer if it didn't require the Predaplant counter to already have been on it, because it's tough to get those counters on there in the first place. So I'd say C tier is probably fair. All right, next is Terrapenthes. This card is outrageous. I think he's an F tier. He's kind of a doofus. Basically what he does, he's 300 attack, and he has an effect where if you inflict damage to your opponent's life points, you can target a monster your opponent controls and place a Predaplant counter on it. It's like, dude, you're 300 attack. How are you inflicting life points with this card? And like while an opponent has a monster on the field, like, how are you doing that? Like, the only way I see this happening is if you use one of the Starving Venoms to change your opponent's monster to 0, and then you do it. But like, that's such an outrageous setup. This card is like so goofy. It has a second effect that's actually not bad, and it would be usable if it wasn't on this card. But basically, you can target a monster that your opponent has with a Predaplant counter, and then you can take control of it. Again, that's a pretty good effect, because you can take your opponent's monster, use it for a variety of reasons. But again, the issue is, like, you can like take an opponent's Baron de Fleur, things like that, and then use its effect against your opponent. Like, there's a lot of cool applications to that, but this monster statistically is like so bad. 300 attack. You have to inflict battle damage to place a counter. It's so outrageous. Yeah, F tier. I just don't see myself using that unless it becomes so easy to place Predaplant counters on things that this card becomes worth playing. Then perhaps. But like, stealing a monster is good, but that first effect is just terrible, and its stat line on this card is horrible. All right, next up is Predaplant Orchid Spider. This card is between D and F tier, honestly. I'd probably say D, but like, it's very weird, because it's not like it's a terribly written card. It's just not really that great in the archetype, like, at all. Actually, I'll put it in F, just because it's very not useful in the archetype. So basically what it does, its pendulum effect, is you can target one other spawn trap card zone, one other card you have in the spawn trap card zone, and destroy it, which doesn't really help this archetype. Like, that would help like Pendulum Magicians, but like, that doesn't really helps Metal Foes, Ignites. I don't really see how that really helps Predaplants. I guess you can destroy Predaplanet, which is this card right here, and then you can use its fusion effect in the graveyard. Like, that's the only application that I think comes to mind. I guess you could destroy like Trilantis and then place counters. Like, there's a few like weird niche applications, but I really don't see why that effect's on there. It's like so out of archetype. And then its second effect is, if this card is normal or special summon this turn during the end phase, you can discard a plant in order to search a plant, which again is a little bit weird, because that really doesn't help the archetype in a lot of ways. Most of the time you're using your entire hand. It's a fusion deck. You use your entire hand. The only card that you might leave in your hand is the ant, because it's a hand trap, but literally all of the other cards you are using as much of your hand as possible. So it's kind of like a weird, slow, grindy effect. And this card has terrible stats. It's 0 attack, 0 defense. And it's just in every way just a worse high scale than the Trilantis. I just don't... It's not that it's like a terrible card. I can see it used in... Like, this card would be great in other archetypes, but it's just so bad in this archetype. It does nothing. It does nothing really that great. It does nothing well in this archetype. Every single effect on this card is done better by some other card. I really don't understand what they were thinking with the Spider Orchid. It doesn't really seem like a Predaplant card. It seems like it was like written for an incorrect archetype, but very, very weird. Next is Orphoscorpio. This is a little controversial, but I'm going to put this probably in B tier. Now, I'm reviewing this as if played in the Predaplant deck. And I'm going to be honest with you, sometimes this card in Predaplants is actually not even that good. Weirdly enough, it's semi-limited in Master Duel, and I don't know why, but yeah, this card sometimes can actually be kind of a little bad in this archetype, because it requires you to send a monster from hand, specifically send a monster from hand, and unless you've got the Dragonfly, the Dragonfly in hand, most of the other cards don't really have graveyard effects when they're sent from hand. Like, nothing really happens. You're sending things to the graveyard for cost, and it doesn't really do anything. And this is a fusion deck, so you need to have as many resources in your hand as possible on the field as possible. You have to retain as many resources so you can fuse as many times as possible, and you don't really want to be like discarding for no reason. Now this can summon any Predaplant monster once you discard the card, but the problem is that this card got a little bit power crept because the new level 5 fusion monster is just better in almost every single way. Because it searches on summon and then it tributes and summons from the deck, so it can trigger the graveyard effect of the cards that that have to be sent from field to graveyard, and it can summon any monster, any level. So in a certain way, in Predaplants, it's not even really that good. And unfortunately, usually this card is just going to eat either an Ash Blossom or an Imperm or something like that, because your opponent always knows to stop this card. And it's so minus when this card gets Impermed, because when this card gets Impermed, I mean, it seriously just hurts when this card gets Impermed, because you go -1 on the discard and you don't get your effect off and you don't get the special summon. Like, it's so bad. So I'd say probably B tier. Next is Predaplant by Splip. I think this card, honestly, I think putting it in S tier is probably pretty fair. It's a really, really good card. And it's one of the newer cards, which is nice. It's nice when your archetype has better newer cards than older cards, because that means that the new support is working, and you're getting new cards that are actually good. But this card is really good. It triggers no matter what. It never misses timing. If this card is sent from anywhere, graveyard, no, I'm sorry, if it's sent to the graveyard from anywhere, so from the hand, the deck, equipped to a monster, anywhere, like literally anywhere. If this card is sent from anywhere to the graveyard, it triggers, and it has an effect to search a Predaplant monster, which is really good. It basically can trigger at any time. It could trigger under branded fusion. It can trigger under anything. That effect is really awesome. And then has a second effect where if you have if there's a Predaplant counter on the field, you can special summon this card for free back from the graveyard, but you have to banish it when it leaves the field, which is not a huge concern because it's no big deal. Again, you banish when it leaves the field. That's a pretty traditional thing in Yu-Gi-Oh, right? Things banish themselves that way they don't get too abusive. But overall, the card's really good. It triggers no matter what, and it's very good for a fusion deck, because fusion decks are very resource intensive. So you're using usually a fusion spell plus fusion monsters and fusion material, I should say. So you have to kind of recur the resources that you're using up, and cards like this are like perfect for this deck. And when you use things like branded fusion, it's even better, because then you're just going plus, because branded fusion doesn't send fusion materials from your hand or from your field. It sends them from the deck. So you're sending things from the deck, and then you're getting the fusion monster that you made off of the branded fusion, plus you're getting additional resources off of cards like the Buy Slip. So overall, just a really, really good card. Probably one of the better pendulum cards one of the better Predaplant cards that they've released recently. All right, next up is the Predaplant Helio. This card is really bad. I'd say it's F tier. First of all, it's in level 8, so you can't even pendulum summon it out, as your high scale is an 8 and your low scales are 1. So you literally can't pendulum summon it out. It's already an issue. It special summons itself to the field if your opponent has a Predaplant counter, and this thing is actually only 1200 attack, and that's all it does. It just summons itself, and then if it leaves the field by an opponent's card, you can special summon a plant or a dark dragon monster from the graveyard. So you can bring back one of your like Venom fusions back from the graveyard. Like, that effect is fine and all, but again, it has to leave the field by an opponent's card, not your card. It can't be polyed away, it can be sent away. So you just have to kind of leave this 1200 attack monster on the board until your opponent gets rid of it, and then you get to bring back a monster. It's just a slow recursion play. It's a bad special summon, and then stats are terrible in every single total way. I just don't ever see myself playing this card. It's one of the worst Predaplant cards out there. All right, next is Predaplant Spino Dionea. I'd say this is like the top of C tier. It's like on the cusp of usability. So basically, on normal summon or special summon, you can place a Predaplant counter on your opponent's monster, and that effect is like kind of okay. It's an easy-ish way to get a Predaplant counter onto things, but honestly, the deck just has better normal summons and special summons than this card. They just create more resources. So yeah, places a Predaplant counter right away. The problem is, again, you can play like Lone Fire Blossom, you can play Orpha Scorpio, like they're better normal summons. And then its second effect is that you can, when this card battles a monster with a Predaplant counter, you can special summon a Predaplant monster from your deck. So again, that's pretty cool, but like you have to enter the battle phase with this monster, and I really wouldn't recommend entering the battle phase with this monster, because usually you want to go to the battle phase with your big fusion monsters, not with like an 1800 attack plant dinosaur. Yeah, this is just better cards, but C tier I think is more than fair for this card. All right, next up is Predaplant Suriciniant. This card's pretty good. I'd say it's probably like top of B, maybe even A tier. It's pretty good. It's a really good like recursion card. So basically what it does, if your opponent declares a direct attack, you can special summon this to your field, and if this card's destroyed by battle or card effect and is sent from the field to the graveyard by card effect, you can, if it's destroyed by battle, you can destroy your opponent's monster. That's already pretty good, because it's like kind of like a hand trap that you can kind of like search afterwards. And then it has a second effect where if it leaves the field, like I said, even by fusion summon, something like that, you can search any Predaplant card in the game. Or if it's destroyed by battle, you can search any Predaplant card in the game. So both of those effects are actually quite good. Really cool recursion effect. I'm probably going to put this in A tier. It's probably a little bit better, especially in the Predaplant deck. It's one of your only, like, first, it's a searchable hand trap that you can add. So if your opponent like breaks your board, you can kind of have some sort of recursion play available too. It's the only thing that makes it worse than the Bliss Biap is that yeah, the only issue with it is that it has to be sent from field to graveyard, whereas with this you can send it from anywhere. You can send it from deck, you can send it from hand, but this has to be specifically from field. So it's like the only thing that kind of holds it back a little. Next is Darling Cobra. Darling Cobra is a little odd. I'd say Darling Cobra is really good, but the problem with Darling Cobra is that it's like in a Predaplant deck, it's actually like kind of bricky, because whenever you draw it, it's just like terrible. You never ever want to draw this card. It's like one of your only bricks, because basically this card, when it's special summoned by a Predaplant monster, it allows you to search any fusion card, any fusion or polymerization, literally anything. It's actually kind of cool. Super poly, ultra polymerization, any branded fusion, like any of the fusions, you can search any of that stuff. But the problem is it basically has to summon off the Orphoscorpio or the level 5 monster, and if you summon it off of anything else, it's just not as good. Like even if you summon it off the spell card, like it's just not as good by any means. And again, you just don't want to draw it because the only way to trigger its effect is to be special summoned off a Predaplant monster. So probably like B tier is more than fair, but it is a very good card because it can search pretty much anything. Alright, next up is Predaplant Squid Drosera. This card's probably, again, another kind of like C tier card. Basically what this does is it's a hand trap. You can send it to the graveyard, and then you can make your monster attack all monsters on the field with a Predaplant counter on them. So that can be sometimes pretty good, right? If you may summon like a Starving Venom, gain attack, and then you can attack all things. Like, that's not a bad effect by any means. It's just, again, getting Predaplant counters on things is probably the most difficult part of the deck, and getting a lot of them anyway. And then the second effect is actually quite simple. When it leaves the field, you can place, specifically the field, you can place Predaplant counters on all cards, all special summon monsters on your opponent's side of the field. Again, that's pretty good, but I would say, honestly, the better card here is Trilantis. Just does it just by fusing. You don't have to do any of this fancy stuff. You use Trilantis, doesn't target, doesn't worry if the monsters are special summon. It just summons them more easily. So the Squid, I'd say, is probably somewhere around C tier. Next is the Predaplant Bafulicula. I'd say this is actually a pretty good card. I'd say this is either top of B, maybe even A tier. Like, I often find myself searching this. This card is essentially a searchable polymerization in the deck, which is kind of in a certain sense cool, because it's a monster. So even the cards that search monsters are still really good for searching out this card, because basically what it does is its pendulum scale effect is basically a polymerization. You can once per turn fuse using monsters you have on the field or in your hands. So literally it's just searchable polymerization, and it is a low scale. It's a 0 scale. And then on top of that, it has another fantastic effect, which is the has the other fantastic effect, whereas when this card leaves the field for essentially like a fusion summon and goes to the extra deck or to the graveyard, you can add back one of your pendulum monsters back to your hand. So you can usually add back a Trilantis if you want to, or you can add one of like the Starving Venom monsters that are pendulums, but you can add them back to your hand, which is pretty cool. In that case, you'd be adding them back to your extra deck. But yeah, that effect is really cool. You can add back the Trilantis. So if you fuse using Trilantis And this monster, the frog, the Bofika, you can basically add back the Trilantis for free. So it's like a free fusion material. Really, really good card. I'd say probably even A tier. Really just a strong card. It's like a searchable polymerization. Alright, next up is Predaplant Cordyceps. This card's weird. I'm going to put it kind of at the bottom of C tier. Like, it's not absolutely terrible, but it's a little bit bad. Like, basically what it does is during the standby phase, you can special summon 2 Predaplant monsters from your graveyard. And then for the rest of the turn, you can't normal summon or special summon or set except fusion monsters. So immediately after this, you essentially have to fusion summon. You can't summon anything else. And that is, number one, that's a little bit slow because it's during your standby phase. But in addition to being like really kind of slow, especially in a going second deck, it's very slow. The other issue is it just locks you so hard into specifically fusion summoning. You can't even continue to summon different Predaplants and then fusion summon. Like as a recursion card, it's not that bad, but I wouldn't recommend playing. Like maybe play 1 copy of this card, but I wouldn't recommend ever playing more than 1. It's not a bad card to send off of like Predaplanting, right? You send it during Predaplanting, put all the counters on things, and then summon this thing out, and then you can OTK your opponent. But I mean, it can be a little bit too slow, honestly. So I'd say C tier is probably fair. All right, next up we've got the Chlamydia Sundew. This is another card that's really good. I'd say it's probably on like B tier, maybe even A tier. It's another one I always play 3 copies of. It's just really strong. It's basically like a polymerization on legs. Essentially, yeah, it treats all monsters that have Predaplant counters on them as dark monsters. So for example, it's very important for making like a Starving Venom. If you put Predaplant counters on your opponent's like water monster, it still counts towards making, you know, Starving Venom or whatever dark monster you have. On top of that, it puts counters on all cards on the field. Like it lets you fuse using monsters in your hand or your field or your opponent's monsters that have Predaplant counters. So it's basically like a super polymerization on legs. In a lot of ways, this card is almost like as good as Verde Anaconda. Like it turns all the monsters with Predaplant counters on them into dark, and you know, as long as you're fusion summoning. And then it also basically allows you to fuse with your opponent's monsters. So in those ways, like, this card is really good, and it's searchable. It's a monster. There's a million ways to access it. The effect doesn't like activate on summon. You can trigger it whenever you want during your turn. Yeah, really good card, really cool effect. A tier is definitely more than fair for this card. All right, next is Predaplant Flytrap. I'd say this card is like a D tier card. It's a little bit of a weird card. Basically, what it does is on summon, you can not on summon, you can activate this effect and then target a monster your opponent controls and place a Predaplant counter on it. And then, of course, as you know, Predaplant counters lower the levels of the monster to 1. And this card, basically, when it battles an opponent's monster, if it battles that opponent's monster and this has a higher level than that monster, it destroys it automatically. So again, all monsters your opponent controls that have Predaplant counters on them become level 1, so it automatically destroys that monster. That effect honestly isn't like that bad. This card is actually pretty cool in like a draft environment. Like, it can basically out any synchro monster. It can basically out like any big monster. It can out as long as it doesn't have like protection of some kind. So like if you have, I don't know, like a huge monster, right? Let's say your opponent has like a Blue Eyes on the field, right? You're playing a sealed draft format. They have like a Blue Eyes White Dragon. You can normal summon this, put a counter on their Blue Eyes, and then attack their Blue Eyes, and it destroys it automatically. In a sealed format, I can see this card seeing some play, but in a constructed Predaplant deck, this is just not like a really good effect at all. It doesn't really like serve the strategy whatsoever. It puts a counter on things, which is like good sometimes. But again, you want to fuse and then go into the battle phase with the big fusion monsters. You don't want to be going into the battle phase with little plants. You want to make Starving Venoms, a Predapower Dragon. You want to make Venomy Dragon. Like, you want to go into the big monsters, not a little plant with level 2 with barely any attack. Also, this card, when it destroys the opponent's monster, it actually gains the levels too. I forgot to say that. Which again is kind of like, sometimes it works because sometimes you need like a level 8 or higher, or a certain level of monster for some of these fusions. But generally speaking, I'd say it's just kind of an okay card. Better in a sealed format than in this format, and then in like a constructed format. Next up is the Predaplant Hydra. This card is like right next to the Banksy Ogre. Basically with this card is very similar in a lot of ways to the Banksy Ogre. Basically what it does is it's a high level monster, but you can special summon it tributing your opponent's monster. It's almost like a kaiju. Tribute it using your opponent's monsters as long as they have a Predaplant counter on that monster. And again, it's kind of similar where it's like the most difficult part of the deck is getting the Predaplant counters onto the field in the first place. So it's kind of weird that, you know, you need the Predaplant counters in order to do this. Like, it's not like a terrible card. It is like technically a searchable kaiju in a certain sense, but I don't think it's really like that fantastic. On top of that, it has a second effect. Now, the cool thing about this one is that you can activate that effect from the graveyard or from the field to tribute your opponent's monster. So that is, like, not from the field, from your hand or from the graveyard. So that effect is pretty cool. Then it has a second effect where you can discards in your graveyard or from your hand. You can banish another Predaplant monster and then make a monster on the field lose 500 attack, and that is a quick effect. So I guess that could be a decent interruption that you can do every single turn. That's really not a bad effect, especially if your life points are close and you need to win a game or you need to attack over something that can actually make a difference. I'd say C tier, maybe play one of this, but not more than one. That's usually what I reserve C tier to. C tier is like maybe a one of, but I would say D and below you probably shouldn't be playing. Next is Pruning. This card is pretty cool. This card is, I'd say, top of B tier. It's like a searchable premature burial, which is, I'd say, pretty cool. Like, a lot of archetypes would love to have this card in their archetype because, again, it's like, it's a searchable premature burial. Premature is banned for a reason. It's a really good card. It's like a searchable monster reborn. You equip the monster and you get to bring back any Predaplant monster, and it's searchable so many different ways. It's searchable with the level 5 fusion monster. It's searchable with the Ant. It's searchable a few different ways, but this card is actually really quite strong. Next is Predapractice. I'd say Predapractice is one of the best cards in the archetype. It's definitely an S tier. Basically, what this card does is it lets you special summon a Predaplant monster from your hand, which is already really good, right? Because you don't have to waste your normal summon. You can trigger the special summoning effects. You can summon the high-level monsters. That's all really, really good. And then it has a second effect where you can basically search any Predap card from your deck. So that includes the monster spells or the traps. All of that is really, really good. So you get the special summon and do that. And then the only thing it does is lock you into fusions from the extra deck. But honestly, that doesn't matter because the only non-fusion that you ever really go into is Verde Anaconda. So, I mean, it's not even like getting locked into fusions literally doesn't mean anything. This card is actually really, really strong and helps the deck significantly. All right, next is Predaplast. Predaplast, I'd say, is definitely like the pinnacle of C tier. Basically, it lets you reveal Predaplant cards in your hand and then place that many Predaplant counters onto cards your opponent controls. Like, this card isn't bad, but again, it's like you always have to go so minus to place Predaplant counters on things, unfortunately. Like, Trilanthus is just the absolute best way to do it. Playing other stuff just can be a little bit dumb sometimes. But yeah, you can target that many cards that you reveal from your hand and then place Predaplant counters. The problem is, again, you're giving so much information to your opponent. I just wouldn't recommend really doing that. And then it has a protection effect in Graveyard where if one of your Predaplants was to die by battle, you can banish this from the graveyard instead. It's not like a bad card by any means, maybe a one of, but I wouldn't play more than one. Next is Predaprime Fusion. I'd say this card is somewhere around B tier. It should be higher, but unfortunately, it's a little more restrictive than you would imagine. So it's a quick effect, that's really good. It's a quick play spell card, which is really good. It's the best type of fusions. Now, the problem that I have with this card is that you can fusion summon from either player's side of the field, but the problem is there has to be at least 2 monsters you control, and they have to be on the field. And that I don't really like about the card. Like, it's basically, you have to do it, but it has to be on the field. It's almost like a super searchable super poly, but it has to be, one of the monsters have to be essentially, only one of the monsters can be your opponent's monster. So you can only really summon the three-headed Predaplant, the Blue Eyes Ultimate of Predaplants. You can only summon that thing with the Predaprime Fusion. You can't summon like Starving Venom or any of the, like, you can summon it, but you have to use your own monsters. So if you want to use one of your opponent's monsters, you can only essentially go into one monster ever. So that's my kind of gripe with the card. Other than that, the card is actually like it's pretty sick because it's like a searchable in archetype polymerization, and it's searchable both through Cobra and all of the cards that search Predap cards or the Predap spawn trap cards. So in certain ways it's a cool card, in other ways it's a little bit underwhelming sometimes. Next is Predaponics. I really like this card a lot. I'd say it's probably B or maybe even A tier. I'd probably say it's like A tier. This card basically, once per turn, soft once per turn, you can special summon a Predaplant monster from your hand or the graveyard. Its effects are negated, but it doesn't matter because its effects are negated, but if they have like a graveyard effect like the Bestiap or the plant or the ant, either one of these, it doesn't matter. If they have a graveyard effect, the graveyard effect still triggers when they're like fusioned off. So that's really cool. You can bring it back and then fusion summon with it and then trigger its effect. So it's basically, it's continuous. So it stays on the field. Every single turn, you basically get a free Predaplant monster back. It has the old text similar to, I forget the card, Imperial Order, where you have to pay 800 life points in order to keep it on the field, and if you don't, this card gets destroyed, but you can choose not to pay it and get it destroyed that way. So I love that kind of old text of Imperial Order. Overall, it's just a good card. It's a free recurable resource that you get every single turn. It's one of the very first cards printed for the deck. Remember, it came out in Fusion Enforcers. Yeah, and it's to this day, it's still one of the better cards available. You only need to play at 1 because it's obviously searchable 3 million different ways. But even at 1, it's a really, really strong card. Next is Predaplanting. Predaplanting is interesting. You can send a so basically on activation, you can send a Predaplant. I'd say it's probably like at the very top of B tier. You can send a Predaplant monster from your deck to the graveyard and then place Predaplant counters on all monsters on the field. And then it has a second effect where if this card's in the graveyard and you fusion summon a dark monster, you can banish this from the graveyard and target and pop a card your opponent controls, or target a card on the field and destroy it. That effect is pretty good. This deck does not have any spell and trap card removal whatsoever. Has ton of monster removal. It searches super poly. It does so much monster removal and so much like placing counters on monsters, negating monsters. It does so much of that, but it does not have any spell and trap card removal whatsoever. That's why certain matchups can be really, really tough. Like if you're playing a really spell and trap card heavy deck, it can be really difficult to out some of their cards because again, there isn't any back row removal in this deck whatsoever. Like in archetype back row removal, it just doesn't exist. You have to play generic stuff like Harpy's Feather Dust or Lightning Storm, etc., etc. You cannot just play the regular stuff. But yeah, overall, pretty good card, and you only have to play it as a one-off because the deck most of the time you're going second when you're playing it. So you could just run one, and just in case you don't UTK, you can just search it off the Predap searchers like Predapractice, and then just have it in your hand ready to go. And the next turn you place a bunch of counters and OTK your opponent. So yeah, I'd say B tier is more than fair. Next is Predaplant. I'd say Predaplant is another one like a top of C tier deck. Basically what it does is it's a continuous trap, and if you have if a monster with a Predaplant counter leaves the field, so your field or your opponent's field, you can search any Predaplant card from your deck. That effect is pretty solid. There's a lot of ways to search already, and they're not on trap cards. That's the thing. This card's just a little bit slow. Like, it's good for grinding resources over a set of time, but it's a little bit slow if we're being honest. Secondly, it has another effect where it can it has a graveyard effect where if this card's in the graveyard, you can banish it and then fusion summon. Again, that effect actually isn't bad, but the problem is this card is a continuous trap. So it's your hope is that it stays on the field. Your hope is not that it goes to the graveyard. You want this card to linger on the field and give you resources every single turn. You don't want it to be in the graveyard. But I guess if it is in the graveyard, it does have a cool fusion effect. I probably at most play it as a one-of, but no more than that. Predaplanting is usually the better trap card to play, but if you were to play like a control build of this deck, which I haven't seen a lot of people play, most people play it going second. I play it going second. If you wanted to play like a control build with like goes in match and because absolutely everything is dark. If you want to play like a control build with like goes in match and like maybe some other like control trap cards, you can maybe get away with playing Predaplanted and Predaplanting and maybe make some kind of a cool looking control build. I don't know. I haven't played too much around with that thought. I think it seems like it'd be a pretty cool deck now that I think about it. Maybe like a control build. Goes in match. You can't run Rivalry because Rivalry is a you can't go into the extra deck with Rivalry on the field. I mean, I guess you can go into certain monsters, but not all. You can go into the Chimera Flesia and stuff. But yeah, I'd say probably a fair placement, C tier. Next is Chimera Flesia. I think this card's like an A tier card. It's a very good card. Basically you can target a monster that has a level lower than this card, and then you can banish it. Already a pretty decent effect. When this card battles, you can make it gain 1,000. Again, like a solid effect. I can't really complain about it. It's 25. It becomes 35. It's not a bad effect. Like, it's a solid effect. It can get over some bigger monsters. 1,000 attack gains, not bad. And then it has a third effect where if this card's in the graveyard during the standby phase after it was sent to the graveyard, you can add any fusion or polymerization spell to your hand, which again is pretty crazy because if this card's in the graveyard, you can add super poly, you can add regular poly, ultra poly, any of the fusion cards. Like, this card is kind of insane. That is a really, really, really strong effect. It is on an extra deck monster, but it's like a really, really cool type of recursion. And again, if you play it in, like, if you send it to the graveyard with like a Nadir Servant or something, you can still get to trigger that effect. And that is like a really awesome part of the card. Yeah, so A tier is probably more than fair for that card. Next is Starving Venom, Predapower, Fusion Dragon. I'd say this guy is he's probably like B tier. The problem with him, he's a little tough to make because he requires I think like a Dark Fusion monster and then like a level 8 monster. Like, yeah, it was a fusion monster and like a level 8 dark fusion monster, but it's something like that. It's something very specific where its materials are a bit specific. So you have to kind of give up some of your boss monsters to make this guy. Now his level, I mean, his attack is huge. I think it's like 3,400 attack. He's definitely the boss monster that you have. His effect is that when a card effect is activated, you contribute a monster on either player's side of the field with a Predaplant counter on it in order to negate that effect. That is not like that bad. You can negate basically anything. And sometimes you contribute your opponent's monster, but the problem is, again, this card just requires like the resources that you have to put into making this card can be a little bit overwhelming. Like, this is great against a hero board, right? Because you can just fuse their board away and fuse away DPE and maybe another Dark Fusion monster. Like, you can fuse away Dark Law and DPE and then make this thing, and that's just like insane value that you get. And then on top of that, this has another effect where if it leaves the field, you can target a dark monster in your graveyard and special summon it, which that again is pretty crazy because it doesn't prevent itself from targeting itself. So if this gets destroyed, you can target itself and special summon itself. That effect is a hard once per turn, so if they out it, you can't use that effect again. It's only if the monster is fusion summoned. So if you bring it back and then it gets destroyed, you can't do it again, unfortunately. But yeah, you got to put a few restrictions on the card. As a super poly target, this does come up sometimes and it's really good, but it's just a little tough to summon in pure Predaplant sometimes. You have to pour a little too much resources into it sometimes. Next is Starving Venom. This guy is a classic. I'd say, let me look down here. I'd say he's probably even an S tier. Like, he has come up so many times over so many metas. Like, as soon as there is a dark heavy meta, this dude just appears every single time. He's really good. All he takes is 2 dark monsters on the field, I think, except tokens. Super Poly is awesome. I love using Super Poly, and so many decks have so many dark monsters in it. That's why this card is so good. You can even force dark monsters onto your opponent's boards by using like the level 7 Kaiju, for example. You Kaiju your opponent's monster, put it at level 7 dark on their field, and then you fuse it away. This card also, when it's special summoned, you could target a monster your opponent controls that's special summoned and then copy its attack and add it to this monster. So this already starts off at 28, I believe. And then, like, let's say they have a 3,000 attack monster, you gain 3,000 attack. It has another effect where if your opponent has, I believe, a level 7 or higher or a level 5 or higher monster on their side of the field, you can actually just copy their effect, that is pretty crazy, right? So, like, if they have a Baron de Fleur, you can just copy Baron de Fleur's effect, and now you can just activate, target, pop something your opponent controls. That effect just goes in super hard. And then it has a last effect where if this card is destroyed, if this card is destroyed and sent to the graveyard, you can destroy all special summon monsters your opponent controls. That again is like crazy, because this one card like outs Barone every single time, because you summon this card, your opponent has the opportunity, you summon this card, you activate, target Barone to copy its attack. If your opponent doesn't negate that, you attack over Barone and you get to copy its ability beforehand. If your opponent does negate it, they negate and destroy this card, and then you get to pop their entire field. Like, no matter what, this card is so good at breaking boards. It's definitely, of all of the super poly targets, probably one of the best. This card is like really good as a super poly target, and it's really good as a boss monster in the archetype because it has so much attack so easily. It can break boards. Very, very strong card. Next is Greedy Venom Fusion Dragon. I think this card's like around B tier. He's kind of like Starving Venom, but not as good. He requires a Predaplant monster, which is easy. and then a dark monster that is level 8 or higher. That one can be a little bit iffy because most of the level 8 monsters are in the extra deck, so you already have to summon an extra deck monster, and then you get to summon this card. So you're usually sacrificing an extra deck monster, unless you're fusing your opponent's stuff, which is fine too. So this card is in a lot of ways similar to Starving Venom. Basically, it can target a monster your opponent controls, negate its effects, and reduce its attack to 0. That effect is really good, right? Because you can negate, make something 0, and then attack for game if you need to. I've done that before. And it has another effect where if it's destroyed, you can destroy as many monsters on the field as possible, and then banish a level 8 monster in your graveyard, a level 8 dark monster in your graveyard, and then special summon this card back. So that effect is like, again, it has recursion for itself, it has destruction just like Starving Venom, and also it can negate and make something 0. So in a lot of ways it's a lot like Starving Venom, but I don't think it's as generic, so you're not as likely to use Super Poly on your opponent successfully, because unfortunately now that no one's playing Predaplant Verde Anaconda, it's less likely that they will have a Predaplant monster on their board, and you have to usually use your own. I would say it's not bad, but it's definitely like a 1-of in the extra deck, no more than that. Next up is Predaplant Ambulo Milides. Very easy to summon. It's just 2 Predaplant monsters. You can also summon it off of Instant Fusion depending on what format you're playing in. It might be legal, it might not be. In TCG it's at 1, and Master Duel it's banned. I don't know what's going on in the OCG, but depending on where you are, this card is or is not legal. But basically, this is one of the best cards in the archetype, if not the best card in the archetype. But basically what it does is on summon it searches a Predap card, so spell, trap, monster. Not only does it search it, it can add it from the extra deck, meaning like a pendulum monster from the extra deck. It can add it from the graveyard, or it can add it from the deck. It's outrageous. Literally can get your cards from anywhere other than banished, which is like actually kind of bananas. Like, it literally searches from anywhere. It has a second effect where you contribute a monster you control or a monster your opponent controls with a Predaplant counter. You tribute it in order to special summon a Predaplant monster from your deck. This card made me second guess playing Orpha Scorpio at all, because this card can actually summon the Darling Cobra from the deck. It can summon Darling Cobra from the graveyard. It can summon Darling Cobra from hand. Like, it can summon Darling Cobra from anywhere, which is really, really good. Not from hand. I'm trying to say from deck. I didn't mean to say that. It can summon Darling Cobra from the deck, which is really, really, really nice. And you don't really have to play Orpha Scorpio, and it doesn't have the discard cost of Orpha Scorpio. Like, this card facilitates so much for the deck. It just depends on your format and whether or not Instant Fusion is legal in it, because Instant Fusion just completely breaks this card. Instant Fusion makes it so you don't even have to put any resources into it. You just drop this card, go +1, and then on top of that, have further fusion material, and then you can tribute either your opponent's monster or your own monster, trigger that effect if needed. Like, even if you trigger the Bistiap from the field, you get the triggered search effect, and then you can special summon more stuff. Like, it is such a great card in the archetype, and it's nice that some of the newer cards are actually some of the best cards in the archetype. I love when that's the case. I hate when, well, I don't really hate it, but like, sometimes it sucks when the best cards in an archetype are the oldest cards in the archetype, because it almost feels like Konami's not doing anything to support the archetype. This archetype, they are very much supporting it, and the newest cards are some of the best cards. Really awesome. Next is Predaplant Dracaspilia. This card's another one that's really good. I'd probably say it's A tier. It comes up to, all it requires is a dark monster and a fusion monster, so it's come up in so many different meta games. As soon as there's a fusion deck in the meta, like, this was really good card in tier limit format. It was good against them, and it was good for them. And a lot of decks in general. It's like very, very strong, very easy to make. It allows you to just put a Predaplant counter quick effect on any of your opponent's monsters. One of the easiest ways to facilitate putting Predaplant counters onto cards. And then has a continuous effect like Skill Drain, where if a monster has a Predaplant counter on it, it is negated. That is all monsters with Predaplant counters. So in a regular deck, this card is really good because it's basically like a quick effect. It's like a quick effect Veiler in a regular deck, right? So if you're playing Super Poly and you're playing, I don't know, you're playing Heroes or something, this card for you is like a quick effect Veiler. But in this deck, it can literally negate a full field of opponent's monsters. That's how good this card is in this deck. Very strong, very easy to summon, very easy to make, and oftentimes it's one of your best interruptions if you're forced to go first. Generally, you're going second, but if you're forced to go first, usually end on this, Predaplanting, a few different things, but it's a very, very strong card. Verde Anaconda is next. Verde Anaconda is S tier. It's less good in Predaplants that you might think, but I can't, like, I can't even fathom putting this card at any less than S tier. It has warped the meta in almost every single region that it's in. It's great in Master Duel. It's great in the TCG. It's banned, and it's great in the OCG. I don't know if it's banned off the top of my head. I don't remember, but either way, it basically turns any fusion card broken, because you can send from the deck, pay cost from the deck, and then get a huge boss monster essentially for free. So it makes certain fusion cards absolutely broken, like Neo's fusion, like Red Eye's fusion, right? You get a Dragoon for free and it's negate. It's like so insane. It's why this card is the reason Dragoon can never come to Master Duel. We're talking about a card that has a huge legacy and it cannot come to Master Duel because this card is just this broken. It is an outrageously good card. Also, a lot of people forget it has a quick effect to turn an opponent's monster into a dark, not a quick effect, but it has an effect where you can turn an opponent's monster into a dark monster, and then that is really extra good in this deck because obviously then you can fuse your opponent's monsters with like Predaprime fusion and then make the three-headed dragon. Like, this card is just very, very good in general. I would say it's not really as good in Predaplants as you might think. It's still good because you can, like, you get two monsters on field and you can basically have access to you can have access to Super Poly, which is crazy, but it's probably more good generically than it is in Predaplants, but I just cannot fathom putting this card in any less than S tier. It's the best card that this entire archetype has ever produced. It's by far the most broken. It is just an outrageously good card. Next is Predaplant Triforovertum. This card's kind of good too. I'd say it's probably like an A tier. This is your main way to OTK. Basically, this card gains attack for every monster on the field. It gains the attack of every monster on the field with a Predaplant counter on it. So that's why the Trilantis is kind of like such an important card. It places Predaplant counters. If you place Predaplant counters on like 3-4 cards, you can easily rack up like 9,000 attack, 8,000 attack, 10,000 attack very, very easily with this card because it gains attack for all of them, and that is just absolutely broken. It has the second effect where it can, if this card is fusion summoned, you can, and your opponent summons a monster from the extra deck, you can quick effect negate that summon. That effect is really good. So even going first, it has some utility. It's not just it's just a pure going second card, which that kind of helps. And that has another effect where if you have a monster with a Predaplant counter on it, if your opponent controls a monster with a Predaplant counter on it, you can special summon this card from the graveyard. But unfortunately, I don't know why they did this, it summons itself in defense mode. And that is really frustrating because summoning itself in defense mode is actually kind of infuriating. Because sometimes you summon this guy in defense mode and he's got like 9,000 attack and he's in defense mode and you cannot attack and he's just kind of sitting there in defense mode for no reason. So I'd say A tier is probably like around fair. That's probably my biggest gripe with the card, is that he summons himself back in defense mode. That is just one of the most infuriating parts of this card. Other than that, like, he's really good. He recurs himself. He's a negate on legs, and he has a ton of attack when you're actually playing in the archetype. And I forgot to mention, it basically requires 3 dark monsters on the field in order to fusion summon. Yeah, pretty good. Like, you can summon it with Predaprime fusion, you can summon it with Super Poly. It's really good with Super Poly because if your opponent actually is playing a deck with 3 dark monsters, you get to out essentially their whole board. And that can be really good, especially if you're playing against something like this is really good against a deck like Labyrinth. Like, if you play this against Labyrinth, I mean, they're going to be in tears because they can't respond to the Super Poly. Doesn't matter if they have Judgment or not, they cannot respond to the Super Poly. And you fuse away their entire board. They go super minus and you get a negate. And you get this huge monster that's going to recur itself, which is just absolutely outrageous. Very good card against certain archetypes, but against a lot of archetypes, it just doesn't really add up to play. Its monster effect is every single time a card is sent to the graveyard, you can place a Venomy counter on this card, and then all of your opponent's monsters lose 200 attack for every Venomy counter on this card. The problem is, usually this card you're going into kind of like later towards kind of the end of your end of your kind of combo. So by the time that's happening, there's less cards going to the graveyard. It also has an effect that can negate all monsters your opponent controls. That's again not like bad, but again it's not like a quick effect. It's an activated effect that you have to activate, and then it negates your opponent's monsters. And it's it's only once. So if your opponent has like unaffected monsters or something like that, it can be a little rough to do anything about. And then when it's destroyed, it can go to your pendulum zone. That effect is actually quite good because you can obviously just keep using its other effect, the pendulum effect. I'd say it's not a bad card. It's just a little tough to make in this deck because you have to summon. You have to use basically Predaplant. You have to use the Predaplant monsters that are the pendulums. You can't use like the other cards. Again, it's not impossible to summon, but I would probably recommend just using the. I'd recommend using the other cards. They're just better cards. It just doesn't. I don't think it does quite enough. To make it worth playing, unfortunately. All right, last card is the Starving Venomy Dragon. I think this card's like a B tier card. I actually think this is better than the the Lethal Dose, because Lethal Dose requires 3 dark pendulum monsters. This only requires 1 pendulum monster and 1 dark monster, so it's way easier to summon. And honestly, its effects are actually better. So I'm not really quite sure why exactly this takes less resources but is a better card. Essentially, what this card does is it allows you to basically target a monster your opponent controls, and you can copy that monster's name, that monster's effect. It reduces the opponent's monster by 500 attack, and it inflicts 500 life points to your opponent. So sometimes, if you need to win in time, for example, yeah, this will help. That'll do it. It's 500 life points. On top of that, on top of the 500 life points that it inflicts, sometimes that can actually end a game, which is pretty good. If you're very very close in life points, that can actually end it. On top of it, when this card's destroyed, it doesn't just get destroyed and go to the graveyard. It goes to the pendulum zone. And its pendulum effect is every single time a card is sent to the graveyard, you put a counter on this card, and then your opponent's monsters lose 200 for every monster on the field except dark dragon monsters lose 200 attack for every Venomy counter on the field. And once per turn, if you are to take battle damage, you can make that battle damage 0 just with this card's pendulum effect. This card is like almost every single way better than the Lethal Dose, and the requirements are so much less specific. Like, I don't understand why this card is so much better despite the Starving Venomy Dragon is so much better than the Lethal Dose, despite this requiring more things to summon. Like, it's such an odd. I don't really know what's going on here. It's just it's incredibly odd. Yeah, this card is just better. Venomy Dragon is just better in every single way. I would say, yeah, this is the entire tier list. That's every single card. Honestly, let's do like kind of like a recap of this deck. I'd say this deck overall is like a fair, strong fusion deck. It's not like as strong as Branded. It's not as strong as some of the other fusion decks. I think it definitely needs some work. It has a lot of the good. It has a lot of good recursion. It has a lot of good like resource acquisition. But I think the issue with this deck is it just needs better monsters to be able to end on. Sometimes some of these fusion monsters require much too many resources and don't really give the deck enough. Like, this gives your deck a monster, a negate of a monster. This gives one targeting. Put a Predaplant counter on something, negate that monster. This is good for outing boards. This is good for like just playing in general. And this is like, again, this is good. These are good like playmakers, play starters for the deck. But for the most part, the deck doesn't really have a lot of great end boards. I think that's where the deck really struggles. Going second can just be tough no matter what, because if you're not in a meta game where Super Poly is relevant, this deck can kind of fall back a little bit, and it relies a little bit too much on things like Super Poly. And generally, I think the deck just needs a little more efficient ways to place Predaplant counters on things. Obviously, they've tried, right? They have Predaplanting, they have Trilantis, they have the Spinea. They have a few different cards that place Predaplant counters on things, but if it was just a bit easier to place Predaplant counters, I think it would unlock some of the better effects of some of these other cards. But overall, I think the deck is probably like one of the better fusion decks that you could possibly play. It's very fun to play, and I would definitely recommend it. If there's any changes you think that Konami can implement to make this archetype better, you could place that down in the comment section down below. It's always a discussion down there. But overall, thank you so much for watching, and have a great day. La, 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 la.